In this episode of Shaping the Future, we are discussing the incoming Biden administration's agenda on climate change and whether they can achieve it. Dan Lashof is the US Director of the World Resources Institute based in Washington and has a long history spanning decades working in environmental policy. In this interview, Dan discusses the need for an integrated action plan that tackles the pandemic, racial inequality, and the economy, with environmental policy being a key driver of change. He also outlines the damage caused by the outgoing Republican administration across over 100 environmental safeguards, while stressing that the challenge going forward will be in achieving a transformation of society within the timeframe that science tells us we have. The US is a key component in global climate action, and the leadership they take now will set the pace for change going forward. Thank you for listening to Shaping the Future. In the next episode, I'm speaking to Professor Jennifer Francis about her recent research looking at Arctic sea ice and Northern Hemisphere warming mechanisms. Please do subscribe to the podcast on all major channels to stay up to date. Dan, thank you very much for speaking to me today. I'm going to start by asking you, how can President-elect Biden make good on his climate commitments given the urgent nature of addressing the pandemic, the economy, and racial tensions in the US?
Well, he's made climate change one of his four top day one priorities, along with those other critical areas. And importantly, I think he is committed to addressing them simultaneously. That is, in the investments that are needed to recover the economy from the effects of COVID, President Biden is going to include a very strong climate smart investment regime in that. So a green recovery is going to be a critical aspect of that. And in doing so, he will also ensure that those investments go to benefit historically disadvantaged communities, particularly communities of color. To cite one example, I think we expect to see a significant investment in electric school buses and transit buses that would go to jumpstart the economy and also reduce carbon pollution, help to start electrifying the transportation sector, and reduce diesel emissions that have a disproportionate impact in communities of color.
Okay, so it's kind of addressing them all in a very interrelated way. The US in particular has been at the forefront of some of the most visual extreme of certainly climate impacts in the last year alone. Can you talk about what effect these have had on the US economy, but also on the public's perception of the urgency of climate change?
Sure. So during the campaign, we were in the midst of unprecedented levels of extreme fire events throughout the western United States with wildfires and storms in the east. The Weather Service, which names tropical storms and hurricanes, ran out of Roman letters and had to go deep into the Greek alphabet to continue naming these storms. Overall, there were at least $16 billion extreme weather events in the US this year of the kind that are enhanced by climate change. So droughts, fires, and extreme storms. So that's a huge impact economically and also politically. For the first time, we're now seeing substantial majorities of the US public who see climate change as something that is affecting them personally and affecting them now, as opposed to a more abstract threat for the future. And I think that played an important role in the election. Based on the exit polls that have been done, we know that President-elect Biden's climate ambition was a major motivator, particularly for young voters to turn out, and they turned out in record numbers.
Okay, and of course, this is all runs completely counter to the whole Trump rhetoric and narrative on climate change. The most public thing the Trump administration did was withdraw from the Paris Agreement. What other damage have the administration inflicted on climate progress in the US during their time?
Well, all in all, the Trump administration has rolled back or attempted to roll back more than 100 environmental safeguards across the government, ranging from allowing continued use of chlorpyrifos, which is a pesticide that's linked to brain damage in children, to opening up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling. But some of the most significant measures specifically related to climate change on the domestic side was to roll back the clean car standards established during the Obama administration, and revoke California's authority to set more stringent standards. So we can expect President Biden to flip that on its head as soon as he comes into office. But just really been across the board assault on environmental safeguards during the Trump administration.
Having attended all the COPs, especially since Trump took power in 2016, it was very evident that it was the states themselves were putting in the presence where at the federal level it was absent. Is there going to be a convergence of all those efforts from state actors with the federal actors, which has kind of been absent? Is that easy to pick up?
Well, I don't know that it's easy, but I think there's a commitment to continue to sustain the leadership that we've seen from states and cities and the private sector over the last 4 years. That, as you noted, is where climate action has emanated from in the United States by necessity. But I think the Biden administration will recognize that in order to make progress at the pace and scale we need, we have to continue that action at the subnational level and build on it and support it. And so I think that's an important part of the agenda. We put out a report at WRI called The New Climate Federalism, which identifies ways in which the federal government should be working with the states and cities to enhance their climate action rather than to supplant it.
You mentioned over 100 areas where the Trump administration have basically done counter-beneficial environmental policy or rolled back environmental safeguards. Can all of those be easily put back? I mean, is there anything that's caused lasting damage?
Well, I think it's all caused lasting damage in the sense that we've lost time, and it's going to vary on a case-by-case basis how quickly the Biden administration can restore strong safeguards. Under U.S. law, there's a process that agencies have to go through to issue rules. And so if the Trump administration has completed the rollback and actually gotten final rules in place that vacated a Biden administration rule or put in place something weaker, there's a process that can take a year or more to reverse that. In fact, the Trump administration tried to shortcut many of these requirements and has lost a number of lawsuits as a result. The Biden administration will want to make sure that it is adhering to the law and doing it properly. And so that will take some time. But our hope is that not only will a Biden administration restore the rules the way they were, but in many, many cases, it will be time and necessity to strengthen them. So if we talk about cars or power plants, we'll need stronger rules than what was in place in the previous administration.
Does that include attempting to accelerate certain timelines where possible as well, given the time lost?
Yeah, absolutely. For example, one area where we clearly need to accelerate the timeline is in reducing and eliminating emissions from power plants. The Obama Clean Power Plan had called for a little bit more than a 30% reduction in emissions from the power sector by 2030. President-elect Biden has called for getting to 100% clean electricity by 2035. So a much more ambitious target and schedule. And the technology that has dramatically improved over the last decade makes that feasible. So we will have to go much faster than what the Obama administration had planned on in many areas.
You alluded earlier to the ways that the Biden response will address different areas, so the economy, racial tensions, pandemic, etc. One of the key areas we hear a lot about in how we tackle climate is around the area of climate justice and equity. Can you talk a bit about how the WRI approaches this in the context of US leadership on climate?
Yes, I think there's several different aspects to this. I think that the first is to recognize the historic burden of pollution to communities of color and other frontline communities that have been suffering from the direct effects of fossil fuel combustion and fossil fuel production, and taking that directly into account in designing policies to make sure that those communities see the benefits of those emission reductions directly. Another aspect that President-elect Biden has committed to in terms of investments for clean energy that would be supported by the federal government, making sure that 40% of those investments go to benefit those communities, either by, for example, building community scale solar in low-income communities, making sure that low-income communities of color have access to clean transportation options, or in other ways, ensuring that investments reduce their pollution burden, for example, by providing for electric buses.
So you're really talking about rebalancing resources across society.
Yes.
So if decarbonizing key sectors across the US is critical to tackling the bulk of emissions, how would you articulate this challenge towards policy making?
Right. So if we follow the carbon, then the first sector to focus on would be transportation. That's now our largest source of carbon dioxide emissions. There, the agenda is quite clear. It's electrifying every vehicle we can as quickly as possible. So the Biden administration will, I think, set standards for new vehicles. They haven't committed to a specific date, but they clearly understand that we'll need to transition to 100% zero emission vehicles for new car sales sometime around 2035, as California has called for doing, and as many countries around the world are starting to do. But not just for passenger cars, but also for trucks and buses and ports. So there's an agenda there that I think is quite clear. Maybe some question about long haul trucking, whether that might use hydrogen versus electricity. But I think the vast majority of our transportation system will switch over to battery electric vehicles.
Okay.
The second sector is in power plants. It's the second most important. There, the dramatic reductions in the cost of wind and solar and batteries really make the job much easier, and that can get you a long way towards zero emission electricity generation. The last 10 or 20% requires some form of dispatchable zero emission generation, whether that's from hydrogen or geothermal or some kind of long-term electricity storage that has not yet been developed yet. We'll have to see, but there needs to be a push there. And are some challenges ahead. But again, in the near term, it's building out solar and wind as quickly as possible, including offshore wind, which is just developing in the United States. And then the third sector is the industrial sector. About a little over 20% of US emissions come from fossil fuel combustion and process emissions in heavy industry, so cement and steel and petrochemicals. This is a challenge because cheap natural gas in the US has led to a boom, particularly in petrochemicals, and we'll need to find ways to green those supply chains. That's going to require quite a research and development agenda, as well as a build out of some carbon capture and sequestration. For example, in the cement industry, where you've got about half the emissions come actually from the process rather than from fossil fuel combustion. And then finally, agriculture and land use sources. The U.S. has a net sink in the land sector from the regrowth of forests, particularly in the Northeast and some in the Southeast. There is an opportunity to enhance that further and plant billions of additional trees across the U.S. landscape so that we can remove carbon from the atmosphere using natural climate solutions.
It's things like the decarbonization of industry, and it seems like these are long-term agendas beyond a decade at least. How do you protect these plans from, say, another Republican win in 4 years, if it happened to be in the same vein as the Trump administration?
Well, that's a good question. And obviously, the preferred approach would be to have bipartisan legislation, which would be more durable. But it remains to be seen whether the votes will be there in Congress. And in part, that depends on the outcome, to some extent, of 2 runoff elections, which will happen in Georgia in early January. But I think what we've seen from the last 4 years is that continued commitments by states and cities and the private sector can sustain climate progress even during a period where the federal administration is trying to pedal in the wrong direction. And by setting in motion investments that drive technology improvement, market forces also play a role. So actually, coal plants retired at a higher rate during the 4 years of the Trump administration than they had during the Obama administration, even though President Trump had pledged to revive the coal industry. And that's just because many of the policies that Obama administration put in place, combined with just investments around the world, have brought the cost of solar and wind down to the point that coal is just uneconomic. And I think we can expect to see that similar dynamic with particularly electric vehicles over the next 5 years and with some industrial innovations.
Okay. You've outlined actions and pathways, etc. How much of it sounds like a list and a plan of everything that needs to be done. Do you think that it can all practically be done? Overall, I know you've outlined, I think, 10 priorities for action in your recent post.
Yeah, I think the Biden administration will pursue all of these and will pursue them vigorously, and I think they'll be largely successful. Whether they are able to achieve the level of ambition that the science really demands, I think is the question mark. So we'll make progress, both because of the federal level and ongoing work from cities and states and the private sector. I think the big question mark for the next several years is, can we make progress fast enough on all these fronts at the same time? That's definitely a challenge. We're going to be working as hard as we can to support that, and many others around the country will be as well.
Okay, and that's really the crux of this whole thing, isn't it? Is trying to meet the science. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me today. It's been very insightful.
My pleasure. Happy. Thanks for having me.